Hey everyone, welcome to week 2. So for part A of week 2, we are going to talk about functions, specifically void versus value returning functions. We will cover how to write functions on your own. We will talk about arguments and parameters, and we'll talk a little bit about scope. So let's go ahead and get into functions. So a function is basically a way to sort of organize your code into smaller parts. So a function is a collection of programming instructions that carry out a particular task. This might sound really familiar to the program definition that we talked about earlier in the quarter. So a function is really a subset of a program. So a program might have a bunch of functions in it, and each function does a really small part of the program, and then altogether the functions, when they act in a certain order, will do one big long program. So the idea behind functions is you sort of want to divide and conquer your program. So by doing this, you break down your program into smaller pieces, which basically makes your life easier as a programmer because it makes everything individually much more easier to code, much more easy to understand, and so on. So this is sort of the idea behind functions. So on the left-hand side here, we have a long program with a bunch of statements over and over and over again. And I mean, it's readable, but it's a little bit overwhelming, right, to see all these statements all one after another and so on. Versus on the right-hand side, we have everything sort of grouped off into different categories. So here we have 4 functions instead, and these are all the same statements as on the left-hand side. It's just on the right-hand side, it's much easier to read. It's much easier to sort of digest all at once because you're looking at 4 smaller pieces rather than one big piece of code. So again, the sort of main idea behind functions is instead of trying to do everything all at once, one big piece of code, you split your program up into individual functions. And these functions will sort of act individually, but then they all come together to accomplish whatever the main goal of the program is. And again, this is going back to this divide and conquer idea. You split up your program into smaller tasks so that it's much easier to conquer or accomplish whatever you're trying to do. So that divide and conquer gives us a lot of benefits. So these are some of the benefits of functions. The book goes more in depth into this, but I want to talk about these really briefly. So first benefit, we've already kind of seen, the code is much simpler, right? And this is both simpler in terms of writing it and then also reading it back. It's much easier to sort of digest smaller pieces one at a time rather than one big long thing at once. It also makes it easier to reuse your code. So the more you sort of break apart your program into smaller pieces, the more likely you'll be able to take those pieces and use them in other pieces of code as well. It also provides better testing and debugging. So let's talk about debugging first. If you are debugging a really long piece of code, it can be a little bit difficult to figure out where exactly the bug is, how to fix it, and so on. Versus if you split everything up into smaller parts, right, which is what functions are, you're splitting it up into smaller, more manageable pieces, it'll be much easier to isolate, okay, the bug is in this section of the code, the bug is in this function of the code, and then it's much easier to see the bug, fix the bug, and then move on. Also makes testing easier. So normally when you are testing a program with functions in it, you'll test each individual function one at a time as you're coding them. So you write a function, you'll test that function, make sure that individual function is working as it should be. Once that function is working, then you move on to do the next function. And that ensures that later on when you're using functions that say maybe depend on another function, you know, okay, I know this function is working, so if there's something wrong in my testing, that means it's something to do with the new function, let's say. Another benefit of functions is that in the long run, it will lead to faster development. This sort of goes to the idea of, let's say you have friends coming over, or you just moved or something, and maybe your house is a mess, and you need to clean your house, right? If you have to think about cleaning your house and thinking about everything all at once, it might be a little bit overwhelming, all the things that you have to do, versus if you sit down, write a to-do list, and sort of categorize what you need to do into smaller tasks, then you can sort of approach it task by task, one by one, and it's much easier to accomplish. So it sort of is that sort of same idea. Going back to this divide and conquer, functions are much easier to write individually because, frankly, they're smaller than full programs, and you write a function, you can write another function, you write another one, and then sure enough, you'll have one big working program. Another benefit of functions, and this is for sort of a real-world scenario when you're working on a team. Generally, when you are working on a program at a company, you'll be working on a portion of a program rather than, writing the entire program yourself. So this way, with functions, you can say, okay, I'm going to write these 4 functions. You're going to write these 4 functions. This other person will write these 4 functions. So it's much easier to sort of split up the group work if you're on a team writing a long program. So these, again, a couple benefits of functions. Book covers it more in depth. Something that I will say about functions is these are something that exists in every programming language. It's not just a Python specific thing. This is actually one of the sort of core pieces of programming is writing functions. So this week, I'd say pretty important week. Alright, let's move on. Alright, so we've actually already used some functions in this class. So I've been referring to these as built-in Python abilities, but they're really functions. So again, functions are collections of programming instructions that carry out a particular task. So here are some functions that already exist in Python. They've already been written for you, and you can use them in your code, and we have used them in our code. We've used print, we've used input. Those are both functions that already exist in Python. We've used these type conversion functions, int, float, str. Those are the functions that take a value of a specific type and then convert it to a different one. We've also seen len, this one that gives you the length of the string. That is also a built-in function in Python. So there's sort of 2 different ways to categorize functions. There's built-in functions. These are functions that have already been written, they already exist for you, and you can use them in your code. And then you can also write your own functions. So we'll talk about writing your own functions later in this section. But believe it or not, we've already been using functions this whole time. Alright, and then the second way you can categorize functions is into void functions versus value returning functions. Now, these 2 ways to categorize functions, they're not related to each other, meaning you could have a built-in function that is a void function. You could have a built-in function that's also a value returning function. You could write your own function that's a void function, or you could write your own function that's a value returning function. These are just 2 different ways you can categorize functions. They're both important, but void function versus value returning functions, these refer to what the functions actually do in practice. So again, function is a collection of programming statements that do some particular task. A void function basically just runs the statements that's in it. That's it. Runs the statements and it's done. Value returning function, it also runs the statements that are inside the function, but at some point it produces a new value and then it sort of replaces itself with the value. And I know that might sound a little bit weird, but for now the main takeaway that I want you to get from this is void functions just run the code, that's it. Value returning functions run the code, make a new value, and then give this value back to the program at some point. They return a value, they give a value back. Alright, so looking at these built-in functions that we've already been using, an example of a value returning function is int. So again, int is this function that you can give it a value like a string, for example, and it will convert that string into an integer, right? So it's making this new value, it's making an integer. And this sort of idea of replacing itself with a value, so if I look at this code, value equals int string 5, let's go ahead and rewrite that over here. So again, we're looking at this line of code. Value equals int 5 as a string, right? This is the code that we're looking at. So because it's a value returning function, this function int5, it actually gives a value back. So if we were to look at this another way, we could say, okay, int string 5, that is basically saying take this string, turn it into an integer. So you can essentially cross this off and say, hey, this is going to be 5 now. It's an integer, it's 5, that's what's happening. Now, of course, you don't actually do this in your code, but you can sort of think about in your code, this is what's happening. We have this line of code, which is an assignment statement. This right-hand side, this is a function, int this 5, this string 5. This function right here essentially is replaced by this number 5 right here, this integer 5. So again, it's being replaced by this 5. And the reason why that's happening is because int itself is a value returning function. It makes a new value and then sort of replaces itself with the value. So this right here can be replaced with this value 5. That's sort of the idea behind a value returning function. Makes a new value, replaces itself with that value. So then later on in your code, after you do, value is now this integer 5, you can then use value throughout your code and it will have whatever that new value was. In this case, it's that integer 5, right? So then you can go on, maybe do another math calculation with it or whatever. Now, on the other hand, the function print that we've been working with, print is a void function. All right, so print is not a value returning function. Print is a void function. It just does something. It just displays the message on the screen, right? So an easy sort of way to determine if a function is a void function or a value returning function is to try to put that function on the right-hand side of an assignment statement, right? So for comparison over here, when we wrote this value, here, let me write it again. When we wrote this value equals int 5, right, this string right here, this makes sense because this part right here, this gives us a new number, a new integer, that number 5, so it makes sense to put that 5 into this variable value, right? It makes sense to do this. Versus this line of code right here, value equals print hello. This doesn't really make sense. And the reason why it doesn't make sense is because this, I can't cross this off and replace it with something else. Print doesn't produce anything new. All it does is it just displays, in this example, hello on the screen. So I can't really say here, all right, value, put something in here. I don't really know what I would put in here in this case. And the reason being is because print is a void function. So again, value returning functions are ones that would make sense on the right hand side of an assignment statement, and then void functions are ones that don't really make sense to do this, like print, for example.